And I'm going to have to speak about the beyond bit, how we can think about beyond, how we can try to get beyond the kind of mental space that this leaves us in, and also maybe start getting beyond politically and physically and economically, reform in the university as one way of getting beyond and over neoliberal capitalism in general. And what I'd like to talk about actually is some of the work that I've been doing outside the university itself. I'm in a very strange place. I used to swim in environments like this, and it only is being up here now that I realise I've now spent so much more time outside of places like this that this now feels a little bit uncomfortable. So it's a very interesting place to be. This is the 5th conference I've attended in 5 years that had the word beyond in its title. I think the word beyond isn't really against and it's not really for. It suggests a kind of malaise and a longing to believe in the betterness of an unspecified place where things are already different, or an unspecified time where they're already likely to have changed. It doesn't really offer coordinates for the future or wave in a general direction. It doesn't even clarify whether here and now is really hopeless, but just kind of says, maybe better go. It's an impulse that I think can be rationalized and therefore one that we need to politicize. The beyond is an important political space precisely because it exists between manifest reality and utopian longing. A space of emergent possibility that can be worked on and feasibility that can be tested. It's fertile ground for both the fear and the hope that real possibility correctly generates in equal measure, feelings that we must also embrace and critically understand. Of course, I think that sort of longing for a beyond place that is not this, if we're still attached to the place that we're in, even ambivalently, is always a kind of dangerous game, a kind of uneducated hope. But I think that once we begin to nurture different and not yet futures actively, humbly, critically, deceptively, bravely, with hearts full of militant hope, ready to learn and to be taught and to unlearn, and in particular to work in practical solidarity with others, to grieve our very real losses and to be enlarged in surprising ways, to reflect on inevitable disappointment and start again, and beyond is space for practicing the special kinds of radical politics which any movement for real social change from below or within in the face of radically concentrated power to prevent it is trying to do. This is a lovely thing on practical solidarity. It was kind of the result of something I attended with a few other colleagues in Portugal. It was a gathering of higher educators from across the world about strategies to start building other new forms of higher education outside the damaging institutions. And I put it up because, first of all, I think it's a beautiful piece of work. And second of all, because when people talk about strategies, I think sometimes I feel like what they're asking me is, what are the kind of techniques that we can use to resist all the things that we're struggling against within our institutions and within ourselves? And I think this is beautiful because actually a lot of the strategies are not strategies that we're used to talking about in these contexts. Healing, removing masks, dealing with traumas, practical solidarities, falling in love, and I don't mean this lightly or flippantly, but I'm thinking about all the kinds of work we do in the union, all the kinds of work we do with our students and elsewhere. And I think it's interesting to look at the difference between the way these things get articulated. I do want to talk about this exciting work that I think is going on, but I also want to clarify some things about where we are in educational politics that I think often are not very clarified. And this leads on exactly from Andrew's finishing point, which was, well, if you think things were worse, they're about to get a whole lot worse immediately. And a lot of us are thinking, well, that can't possibly be. I think we can safely stop asking whether schools, colleges, and universities in the UK are sufficiently compromised by the logic of capitalist value and its associated managerial technologies to justify the radical critique of their transformation or their abandonment. So is higher education losing its progressive potential? The answer is yes. We know that these institutions are economically and politically designed to repress democratic intervention, self-governance, and critical and transformative knowledge in the interest of market power, and that they are increasingly empowered to do this. Andrew's just shared with us a concrete analysis for some of these mechanisms, and we can add this to our existing knowledge. I looked up last night the basic words, neoliberal and higher education. Over 17,000 academic articles. We've been documenting this for 40 years. We can add this to our knowledge of the de-democratization of university governance, the perfection of managerial power, the recalibration constantly of labour contracts, as anyone working in the union will know, the marketization and privatisation of institutions, the valorisation of the patriarchal neoliberal subject, the institutionalisation of hostility to radical creativity and radical critique. Every round of pro-capitalist, anti-social and anti-intellectual regulation that has been imposed on and implemented through universities and academics since the 1970s has made it very hard to work autonomously, collectively, teach critically, cooperate with social movements, conduct research in the common interest, and easier to run education as a business. And these closures also extend into institutions of popular education. So the question now, I think, is not whether the university is losing progressive potential, but what is it that makes it continually possible for people to believe or hope that this is not the case, or that its potential is somehow going to be magically restored. There's something about this attachment and this slight delusion that I think we need to look at in terms of how this power operates through us. We do a lot of things, and I won't go through the list of all the things I have, but we write, we organize conferences, we attend seminars, we do workshops, we strike, we occupy, we experiment with pedagogical forms, and I think these are all very important activities that we should continue to do. They create and sometimes keep open spaces of possibility within institutions where counter-hegemonic discourses and kinds of learning can flourish, where people make sense of each other, we build friendships, solidarities, we find reprieve and respite, we find sensible languages and nourishment and a sense of being home. But I think there are still quite a lot of these things, or these things are often done in quite a lot of ways, that are still within the logics of the institution, within the logics of the labour contract, on its edges, just shy of the radical encounter that we probably are hoping for. What they don't do is allow us to be taught by what we cannot do, by the need to confront the antagonisms within our own subjectivities, that we want to salvage the university and destroy it at the same time, that we recognise the violences of the system and talk about them constantly, while on our way to socialise other people to join us. That we avoid making that decision today, that decision of whether to really fight for a better university system, or whether to really direct our energy elsewhere, because either way the decision changes everything, and at the moment we just have too much else to do. And that's a very real thing, we just have too much else to do. And then here comes Andrew, more regulation that will make some of these critical practices even more difficult. So we are seeing a kind of exodus, and a kind of explicable exodus. People leaving all the time. You see in newspapers. They aren't even using their names. Why can't we use our names? I'm leaving the academy. I will no longer put up with low pay, unstable contracts, etc. I can offer more to the public outside the university system. And what interests me as a research question and a practical question is this: I will no longer put up with, which means I leave. There's something about the not putting up with, and therefore I'm leaving. There's not a fight in that. So what's interesting is not that people are exhausted or that this needs to be explained, it's completely understandable, but where is the construction of that indignancy and that fight and that desire, that need to create higher education for other people? It's not only here, it's in schools. I'm being forced out of a career that I wanted to love, and then 30 years later I had to leave a profession I loved. In the NHS, the same. What is this force? What is forcing us? And where is that struggle? I think what's interesting in terms of some of the places I've been more recently, where I've been very out of place in lots of ways, is that actually most people don't find it difficult at all to imagine being outside of the neoliberal university, because it's never had any relevance for them, or they've always found the university an exclusive and damaging place. Other people don't have to choose whether to struggle against or flee from the oppressions of police state or corporate capital or patriarchal violence, because they encounter these power in moments of dignity or in life and death, including in matters of education. But they've actually told me recently that they think it might be harder to act in conditions of low-intensity warfare, where these things aren't so cut and dry, because the choices seem so much less clear. As a result, I think therefore questions about what we each do, practicing critical education and creating conditions for its possibility, can only be answered through experimental praxis. And in practice, the role of knowledge, the role of the university, the role of the educator, the role of academic work is contextual, dialectical, emergent, imperfect, and not entirely dependent on our own actions. What matters, I think, is our ability to identify limits and possibilities, wherever these are, to work at the edges in these contradictions, including at the edges and in the contradictions of our own imagination and our own possibilities for hope. So I think, basically, we need them all. We need all of these different options within and without at the moment. And I think also it's important to understand that the antagonisms between them. And my interest lies now in how to create knowledge and conditions that make it more possible for people to undertake, reflect on and collectively develop these experiments. Building infrastructures of practical solidarity, autonomy, dialogue and critique, which expand breathing spaces within the system and sustain more radical experiments in counter-capitalist living outside of it. I see this as a very important time because I don't think we're there yet. I don't think it's the radical moment yet. I mean, it is in lots of cases all over the place, but I think there is an important time of building that we need to recognize that this is worthy work to do, even if sometimes it doesn't look so radical, doesn't feel so radical, feels completely ineffective. I think we need to keep going. So towards this end, I wanted to share a little bit about some of the counter-hegemonic forms of higher education that I've experienced in projects that are or seek to become resistant to, autonomous from, and alternatives to neoliberal values, subjectivities, institutions, and economic relationships, including the ones that Andrew has just been talking to us about. One is a project that I've been part of since 2011, which is a higher education cooperative called the Social Science Centre, based in the city of Lincoln. The other is a gathering I recently attended of radical educators from across the North and South, who are working for ecological and social justice in a plurality of forms which are necessitated by our responses to the needs of their communities, and which don't look like anything that exists within the boxes of what we usually talk about as being higher education. What these other experiences are teaching me is that practice is so key. I've always thought that practice is key. I said that practice is key, but I only learned that practice was key when I started trying to practice. The more I fill my conceptual space with counter-capitalist epistemologies and values, the more time I spend in life-affirming and liberating situations, the more relationships I have with cooperative and critical people, the more time I dedicate to these projects, the more I value these alternative forms of recognition and fulfillment, the weaker the hold of the attraction of the neoliberal university and institutionalized academic power become, and the more partial and contingent and unnecessary it appears. The weaker these emotional and financial attachments become, the more the contradictions and tensions emerge in my identity, my epistemological and ontological securities, my intellectual work and my everyday life, and the more these contradictions surface, the more opportunities I have to make more conscious decisions about the life I want to lead with others, in particular my relationship with higher education and research. And the more I learn about how and why others are making very bold and radical decisions in their own circumstances, the more expansive my own horizons of possibilities become. And the more I become receptive to different ways of knowing and being, the more tools I think I have for developing. The promise of prefigurative politics is that radical and social change is not dependent on a rare revolutionary event. It's not a long trek with no benefits until an end goal, nor is it an attempt to hold an imaginary future in the present, straining against the boundaries of the possible, but a generative, iterative, and educated process through which we seek to consolidate existing practice and release the imagination of what could be. I've been asked about the practicalities of this work, and my first thought was, there really aren't any, you just kind of do stuff. But that's not going to be satisfying to anybody, because I've been asked to talk about how people turn ideas into realities, how we break from institutional dependencies, how we become counter-hegemonic in our epistemology and forms of common sense, and so on. And in some sense, I thought, well, I can't do that because I don't do that. I feel like a bit of a fraud saying that I know how to do that. So I'll just clarify that I don't think I do that all the time, or even some of the time very well. In relation to my own cooperative, this is always a challenge. We've had a huge amount of work setting up the Social Science Centre from Cooperatives UK, Radical Roots, the Sunak Centre, and other workers' cooperatives and social centres. But it actually feels like we are always and forever in the process of learning and unlearning and articulation, fumbling through. And one of the reasons we don't talk about it a lot is because there's a lot of stuff that goes on that just isn't quite, it's not quite there for a motivational speech or something. And I think part of the practicality of counter-capitalist education is learning to be at home in this state of unsettled, dialectical and perfect states of affairs, and developing new ways to articulate them. Unlike longer running programs in workers' education and popular education that draw their energy and legitimacy from communities of struggle and long histories of resistance, The SSC grew out of a belief that when universities privatize learning in the critical disciplines, the teaching of these knowledges must be relocated into the social commons. So it was established in a moment of crisis as an alternative university. It was kind of sort of, we carried a lot of the frames with us, and we still carry a lot of the frames with us. So it's been almost 5 years of kind of deinstitutionalizing, deprogramming, and unlearning those things and trying to understand which ones we're going to keep. As one member of the cooperative said, this is still a tender project. Well, much of the published work about the social science centers describes it as a radical project dedicated to the democratization of higher education. It also cultivates, I think, a less visible kind of radicality that I think is more important. And this is the formation of a collective subject that has to find new ways of going on together in the face of uncertainty and disagreement. The process requires a commitment not to turn away from many habitual fears and ways of doing things. It forces our usual tools of critical pedagogy and critical theory out of their institutional homes and teaches us how dominating knowledges, including these, lose their composure and serenity when they are interpolated by questions, no matter how simple, that they did not ask themselves. The task of organizing this work requires other kinds of learning than we're used to doing. Cognitive learning, social and emotional learning, about the conditions of radical democratic association, autonomy and struggle. As the philosopher Nicholas Comfort suggests, we must insist on the possibility of another kind of reason, another way of living in practice, which is not merely an abstraction or something utopian, but an actual possibility that we locate in existing and marginalized practices of reason. And I feel like I'm learning a lot about what it looks like and feels like to locate an alternative form of reason in marginalized practices. And what that means is no one really thinks they're important. No one really thinks they're very useful. But they are incredibly interesting spaces of learning. In addition to this, if we are to overcome the negative effects of the dominant forms of reason, we need to weaken our attachment to them to make room for neglected, devalued, or suppressed forms of reason. Weaken the attachment to the neoliberal university. Weaken the attachment to these needs for recognition. Weaken the attachment perhaps even to the kinds of labor contracts that we are participating in. We have to learn how to participate in different ways. Participate with committed involvement. It doesn't depend on institutional contracts. Commitments to other people. Being present as a subject of history, commitment to its cooperative formation. Believing that we can mediate the world, knowing that we can't control that mediation. Being willing to be thrown into what is becoming, including ourselves, rather than being a spectator, subordinate, or consumer of ideas or policy or product. Not being assaulted by the graphs that we just saw. Looking at them and thinking, oh my God, we will never be able to survive that. I think I'll have to leave. I don't know what's going to happen to me. Looking at those graphs and thinking, they are a cause for a fight. Or, if they're not a cause for a fight, what really am I doing? Right? So fine. If this is not worth fighting for, I think that is important for each of us to decide. But then, what is it, really, that we are doing? So I've got 5 minutes. I had a whole bunch of stuff on receptivity, how we can learn to become receptive. Receptivity is not something we are good at teaching. I think in the university we perform a lot. We're trained to perform, we're trained to know, we're trained to compile, we're trained to cite, we're trained to invent, constantly come up, produce. Receptivity is a little bit different because it requires being radically open to the stuff that we are not sure about. And as someone trained as a critical theorist, that's a very scary thing. It feels like you're giving up critique, and I think it doesn't need to be that. Learning to cooperate, I could give a whole series of talks on that, because I think cooperation is a very weak muscle, and I think it's fascinating how much we have to learn how to do it outside of institutions. And then I had some stuff, anticipatory reason. However, this is please visit our website. These are some of the things we're doing, courses, public events, research. I think really what I wanted to say is most of the learning that I think is important is in all the stuff that goes around organizing this. And that's the stuff that's going to carry us through. That's the stuff that people talk about as being transformative more than anything else. I did want to mention this event, partly because this guy at the top, whose name is Eduardo, he works in Oaxaca at the University of the Earth. He says we're going to win, and he has told us that we have a cargo, which is committing to our communities to report back what we've heard. So I wanted to share a little bit about this extraordinary event with 50 people from across the world who are doing higher education practice in ecological, artistic, cultural, and indigenous movements. in some ways this was a predictable mess, right? So this is really outside the frame of what I'm used to thinking about as a university. But it's also the most effective event in reimagining the university I've ever been to, reimagining the university, because in 6 intense days, it was more like a psychotherapeutic encounter in lots of ways. Lots of decolonization going on, lots of really serious stuff coming up. But actually, we never were able to talk about higher education. And the reason we weren't able to talk about higher education is because it was already deconstructed, because it was already so diverse, it was already so problematized, it was already so much under question. It wasn't something people felt like they had to escape from. It was something people did in all kinds of different ways. And being in this space, this is what I wrote while being in it. Days of respite from fighting the riptide of everyday capitalism, that powerful current sucking back, down, further, deeper, out to a lonely, expansive place that is not mapped onto our existing cartographies of resistance and hope. A place where people can see each other but not touch each other. A time of knowing that swimming in any direction is exhausting and that even saviors may drown. We tread water for a while, maybe forever, and then we close our eyes, shut our minds, put our hearts away, let dreams die, and we inhale. Or we open our eyes, liberate our minds, heal our hearts, let our dreams die, let our dreams live and inhale. We drown or we learn to breathe water. 6 days of oxygen, 6 days of learning that we already can live in alternative realities, that there are different out there and that we can inhabit a different here, that there are lines of flight which imply struggle but of different sorts, that there are paths of liberation which are not made by swimming at all. And I think what struck me about being here is that there are languages of grief and loss that we tend not to use when we talk about struggle for in the neoliberal university here or against. In trying to create something new and trying to create something different, especially I think for someone like me who is enormously attached to the idea of the university, the value of radical education, the importance of the academy as a space for critical utopian and political potential, there is an enormous loss in imagining that we could be doing something different elsewhere. But there was something, I was very surprised in this event about the languages of violence and trauma, about institutional violence, about bad education, dehumanization, alienation, abstraction, dispossession. And I kind of wondered where that language was in our own talk about the university and whether or not some of that language would help us. And then, I won't tell you what this is because that's the green thing, because that's too complicated. It's from a different event that I went to, which is, again, reimagining the university. And I think the fact is, we kind of know what we want. We may want different things in a nuanced way, but, you know, capacity for critical reflection, autonomy, meaningful contributions to social change, etc., etc. You know, it's not, we don't need to do a lot of thinking about that. The question is how we push over. So this here, what would push you out of the university if you had this workshop? All the things that people said would push them out of the university have already happened to them, and already happen to people every day, and yet we're staying. So I really want to work in this space. What is it about that we can capture, and what is it about that we can learn from? Gustavo Estevez, who is one of the founders of the University of the Earth in Oaxaca, Mexico, this is a quote from someone else that he quotes. And he says, suppose you had the revolution you are talking and dreaming about. Suppose you decided won and you had the kind of society you wanted. How would you live in that society? Start living that way now. Then whatever you do, do it now. When you run up against obstacles, people or things who will let you live that way, begin to think about how to get over or around or under that obstacle, or how to push it out of the way, and your politics will be concrete and practical. And I think I really wanted to ask, you know, one of the things we could do is, we could imagine the university doesn't exist. Would we still do the work that we do? Would we still want to create institutions like this to do the work that we do? If so, why? And how is that possible? If not, why not? And what would we do instead? Do we need the university to do the kind of work that we do? And what does that say about the kind of work that we do? If so, what do we do to make this possible? If not, then what? I think, I know I'm playing over by a minute. So I think that knowing that there are alternatives out there in principle isn't enough to make concrete and critical hope and social change possible for me or for you or for anyone. As Raymond Williams once wrote, the potential cannot reasonably be doubted. It is the immediacy that's the problem. the construction of paths and bridges, spaces and infrastructure for learning, signposts for waymaking and way stations to nourish us on the journey, I think is essential work and struggles to radically democratize neoliberal societies today. And I just think that actually trying to find some of these spaces to be in some of the time gives an awful lot of breathing space and decenters all of this really oppressive power so that actually it becomes easier to work with. I had a sort of film clips from a lovely film done about the Red Crow College in Canada, which I'll just maybe put up later. But it is a fascinating video. And Blackfoot knowledge about what higher education is, I think, is just another way of looking at university that is really provocative. So that's all I now have to say.
Thanks very much. Two really very different but I think really fascinating keynote speakers. So I want to thank Sarah and Andrew.